we can say also maybe to our colleagues within the Asia region, it's a good evening to you. I would like to welcome you to this special session that we are looking at resource mobilization and accountability for rural youth in Africa. And today we have such a high level sort of panel of speakers or contributors to this particular session. And we have also well-renowned people contributing to this particular webinar. At this point in time, I would like just to take you through some housekeeping issues. And as I said, my name is Nelson Gomonda. I work at the African Development Bank. Just for purposes of us to be orderly in this particular session, I'd like to share that, first of all, we are recording this session. The reason why we are recording is to make sure that maybe those that could not join this session are able also to follow what transpired during this particular event. And we'd like to encourage you, our speakers, as well as participants, to keep yourself muted in the main session. But also would like to encourage you, our participants, just to introduce yourself by writing your name, your organization where you are joining us, and also the country. And you can do this within the chat box. So you'll see some areas where you can just chat and update these particular details that I've requested. But if you have a special question, especially in the course of the contribution from our speakers, feel free to raise that question or make a comment via the Zoom Q&A box. And you also find this at the lower bottom of your screen. And we would like to make this session very interactive. So we'll try to make sure that the questions that you raise, there is also response, especially from the speakers as well. And if possible, you can try to raise the name of the speaker that you're raising the comment or the question. We'd like also to say that you can put your comments in the chat box. And again, if you have an opportunity to speak in this particular session, then please make sure that you switch on your cameras so that we can appreciate your contributions. And if possible, please fill out our short survey at the end of this particular webinar, which will be sending to you as well. Now, let me also share with you some good news about this particular session. We have some interpretation, and this is simultaneous interpretation in both English and French. And if you want to choose a language that you feel you are comfortable to follow this meeting, please kindly select the interpretation icon in the bottom control bar of your screen. And within that, you can select the language you would like to hear this particular session. Now, let me just quickly run through the program. I have just been asked to help with the housekeeping issues at this stage, but in the next few moments, we'll be handing over to Catarina, who is the moderator, the main moderator for this particular event, and she will give an introduction to the e-discussions. Then after that, we'll transition to the contribution from speakers. And as you can see on the list, we have quite a number of distinguished speakers as well from the bank, from ANEW, from UNECA, from the parliamentarians in Uganda, but we also have WaterAid and CABRI. These will be introduced well by the moderator at the right time. And after that, we'll have some Q&A where we can have a little bit of conversation and interaction with you, especially based on the chat or questions that you might have raised in the Q&A. Then we'll finish off this particular session with a call to join the e-discussion and, of course, closing remarks from our colleagues at the IRC. Now, let me have the opportunity and the pleasure of introducing you to you, our moderator today. She is Catarina Fonseca. She is the associate of IRC and the Senior Advisor on Finance for Sanitation and Water for All. Catarina is an economist with a doctoral degree in water sciences, and she has over 20 years of experience in the water and sanitation sector. She's an advocate that everyone, everywhere, has the right to clean water and the dignity to access sanitary and hygienic facilities. She advises and trains a range of clients from governments to civil society, bilateral agencies, development banks, and other international organizations. She's an associate at the IRC and a senior advisor, as I mentioned earlier on finance for the Sanitation and Water for All, which is a global partnership. And in 2019, I should get the date right, in 2019, she created her own company titled Push Tide or Pushing Tide or Pursing Tide. Now I got it right. Sometimes I'm thinking in French and speaking in English. Pursing Tide, that's the name of the organization. Over to you, Catarina, and it's so a pleasure to have you with us on this particular call. And thank you for accepting Lily to moderate this session as we cast a spotlight on rural WASH, especially financing and accountability. Over to you, Catarina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nelson, for the introduction, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having all of us here, and thank you for listening. So we're here on the session on resource mobilization and accountability, but specifically for rural water, sanitation, and hygiene. I mean, if many of you have been involved in a lot of the finance discussions over the past 5 years, and we're talking a lot about raising additional finance for the sector, but the focus really seems to be on urban areas and on small towns. We're talking about financial instruments, we talk about professionalization of service providers, even the discussions on tariffs have become much more sophisticated. And more recently, we start talking about finance for water and sanitation, which also ensures climate resilience and mitigation. But these discussions, the trend seems to be on urban and small towns and not so much for rural water, sanitation and hygiene. And this is why we are having these discussions. Next slide, please. This is why we are having the e-discussion has been organized specifically with a focus on rural. And this topic will feed into the 9th World Water Forum, also into the United Nations Thematic Report 2022, and many other advocacy opportunities that many of the organizations which are on this discussion today are also involved in. Next slide, please. So, resource mobilization and accountability for resource use, these are very big words. So let me just break it down a little bit. What does this mean? What are the speakers going to talk about, and how the discussion is organized over the coming months? So the first week, it's going to really be talking about increasing the level of understanding of what we call the enabling environment, or the foundations for increasing water sanitation finance in rural areas. As most of you know, most, if not all, of the bottlenecks to raise additional finance for rural WASH have actually to do with governance. We're talking about the money is there, the money is available. We're talking about a set of conditions that need to be in place for resources to be mobilized. So that's the focus of the first week. The focus of the second week is inspirational, is documenting funding models and approaches specifically for rural WASH. And many of these approaches actually have to do with using existing resources most efficiently. Finally, the last week of the discussions are focusing on resource mobilization for those that are being left behind, but also for other stakeholders with an important role, such as the private sector. And private sector, again, it's a very big word. It means many different things in many different settings. So we're going to try to unpack some of those. So today we have an amazing panel of speakers. I'm very excited about it, which will touch on some of these aspects and hopefully will kick off some of the discussions. And please use the chat box if you have questions, because the speakers are also online. We can also respond immediately with the chat. Use it for Q&A, and then we will bring some of those questions later to the discussion. Next slide, please. I think in terms I need to introduce, yes. So this is how you can join the discussion after this call. I will put this slide also towards the end. There's a D group, and then you just have to follow the instructions. It's very, very simple. And next slide, please. The expected results for the discussion is really a summary of each week's discussions, thematic reports, which then, as I mentioned before, will feed into the 9th World Water Forum discussions. And it's very important. We really need to have the right narrative on finance around increasing finance for rural water supply and sanitation services. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, I think. Yes. So I also would like to draw your attention to a very recent publication from AMCAL, which is on financing water supply and sanitation. And it has all the latest data on coverage, access rates, inequalities. They were done specifically for this report by the JMP team at UNICEF. And it has very interesting tips on how to engage with finance ministers as well. So I recommend you. It's a very brief and very advocacy focused presentation. It's also available in 4 languages. And if you can't somehow access them, please write me a note. I'll make sure I put the links also in the chat box. So we will have 6 speakers, and in this session, as it was mentioned by Nelson, I hope they are going to be very kind with all of us and stick to the 4-minute intervention, so then we can still have 20 minutes of Q&A and then the closing remarks. And without further spending time on introductions, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mr. Ijeoma Emenanjo. He is an officer-in-charge manager and chief water resource management officer in the Water Coordination and Partnerships Division of the African Development Bank. He brings over 15 years of professional expertise in delivering projects focusing on integrated water resources management, international climate finance, regional integration, and food security, extremely cross-sectoral. Ijeoma holds a master's degree in natural resource management and public administration from Harvard and Maryland University, respectively. So, Mr. Emenanjo, can you please tell us what is the approach of the African Development Bank to actually reduce the gap, the finance gap, specifically for rural WASH? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to sort of kick off this session, which casts a spotlight on issues related to resource mobilization and accountability for resource use for water for rural WASH. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you are. The African Development Bank, with an active portfolio of $5 billion or so, is really well positioned to champion and customize local solutions by sharing global knowledge and amplifying the impact of financing. However, building institution and infrastructure needed for universal access and sustainable water management demands a vast increase in financing, as we all know. And at the bank, we will continue to explore ways to mobilize more resources. But I am persuaded, especially after COP26, that the rural WASH sector needs to focus a lot of its efforts on securing climate financing. At the bank, we also believe in the role of the private sector in developing rural WASH. But we need to demonstrate value for this sector to be involved and show that we can create bankable rural WASH projects. As we prepare for the 9th World Water Forum, which has a dedicated theme focusing on water and rural development, we must also begin to prepare to demonstrate what works. The bank really remains committed to supporting regional member countries in achieving their targets for rural WASH services in Africa, in line with the Africa Water Vision 2025 and SDG 6. This is reflected in the bank's water strategy 2021 to 2025, which is set to be launched tomorrow afternoon. The bank's water strategy presents the bank's strategic focus, priorities, and actions to operationalize its policy on water approved by the board in May 2021. The strategic goal aligned with the bank high fives, the SDGs, and the Agenda 2063 is to improve Africa's water security and transform its water resources to foster sustainable, green, and inclusive socioeconomic growth and development. Both of this sort of policy and strategy documents are a result of extensive consultative process, followed by a period, and they reflect the views and main feedback from a wide range of stakeholders in the African region and beyond. We really looked in the sector to look at, I think what's also happening in terms of urban wash, and a lot of, and there are real opportunities to sort of learn, but until we sort of get, the idea that around bankability, these projects will continue to really suffer when it comes to financing. So really, I hope this is sort of, I know it's a very brief sort of kickoff, but I wanted to give an opportunity to really focus on discussion. So really thank you for your kind attention, and I really look forward to fruitful deliberations on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ijeoma. And I mean, I think we will come back to what exactly do we mean when we talk about bankable rural water projects? Is this actually realistic even in the context of the African continent? So some pointers for discussion. Our next speaker comes from a very different perspective. Serene Malik leads ANEW, which is the umbrella organization of water sanitation NGOs in Africa, which are present in over 50 countries. She's also the vice chair on the SWA steering committee. Serene has over 15 years of experience in the field of water governance, and she focuses on working with NGOs to meaningfully engage in the water sector and in anti-corruption, mobilizing civil society voices for good water governance. Mrs. Malik, what can be the role of civil society in resource mobilization for rural wash? Over to you. Please unmute yourself. Serene, are you there? I'm checking. I see you have the mute on. Yes.
Hi, sorry about that. There seemed to have been a glitch in the connection. Am I clear?
You are, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Catarina. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of you. Thank you for having us. And I'm going to try and keep this within the 3-4 minutes that have been allocated. I think Catarina really summed it up, that a lot of the bottlenecks are usually governance bottlenecks. Now, I was just sharing with our colleagues here for Accountability for Water that within their action research programs, found some really interesting findings and evidence, which I think it is really important to share with you, and how this links to the issues of resource mobilization and accountability of those resources. Now, they found that 80% of the articles, in terms of the evidence, associate positive outcomes for water sector governance with accountability and advocacy interventions. 32% found positive impacts. Now, 28 factors were associated in the performance of accountability and advocacy interventions. And from the highest to the lowest, the most frequently associated with positive outcomes were constructive approach, training, leadership in champions, taking a strategic approach, good public communications, dialogue and convening, and high levels of trust and legitimacy. Now, what was mostly associated with negative or no outcomes was a poor understanding of community and power dynamics, ambiguous institutional responsibilities, weak interagency accountability, a challenging water use context, limited financial resources, and low levels of trust and legitimacy. Now, in 2019-2020, we conducted a report in Kenya that looked at the integrity of the public financial management system. And there were a number of hotspots that had been found. First, of course, more and more we are seeing our governments and we are seeing our space, our civic space expanding, where as civil society we work very hard to ensure that people are in a position to claim their rights. But some of the hotspots that were identified, especially in the terms of resource mobilization, but as well as the accountability, were really the traditional ones that you are well aware of, which is, of course, the issue of public participation in the various budget cycles, the difficulties with the use of the different decentralized fiscal management systems, issues with resource, the absorption, issues at the policy level, and general political interference. So I think these just sum up a bit some of the issues that we are seeing. And again, more investments are required in terms of governance and advocacy interventions. More resources are required in terms of simplifying and mainstreaming really some of these systems. Thank you very much, Catarina.
Very impressed. You're all sticking to the 4 minutes. Thank you, Serene. So summing up, more accountability in resource use leading to more trust in the institutions in the sector, leading to more funding and resource mobilization, and civil society has a big role to play in that. Thank you for that. Now, we move to another speaker. Very interesting. Jean-Paul Adam is the Director for Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resources Management in the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa since 2020. He previously served in several cabinet positions in the governments of Seychelles, including Minister of Finance, Trade and Blue Economy in 2015, where he negotiated the debt for climate change adaptation, which placed 30% of Seychelles' oceanic space under protection. He also launched the process for Seychelles to become the first issuer of a blue bond. He also served as Seychelles Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister of Health. Mr. Adam, financing rural WASH with sophisticated financing instruments such as blue bonds, debt swaps, it's not commonly heard of. So can you please give us your advice on how do we mobilize climate resilient finance, particularly for rural WASH? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catarina, and thank you to all of the other panelists, because I think that it's incredibly timely to have this kind of conversation just after the conclusion of COP26, because there is obviously a very strong link between climate resilience and solutions that address the resources that are needed for investment in water, sanitation, and hygiene. And the points that I will speak to are particularly in how we can address the issue of climate resilience, mobilize resources for investment in climate resilience, but most critically tackle the needs of water, sanitation, and hygiene in a rural setting. So firstly, I think we need to recognize the need for alignment in terms of national frameworks and budgets to actually invest in climate resilience and identify those linkages with water, sanitation, and hygiene. What we are seeing, for example, around nationally determined contributions that are made under the context of the Paris Agreement, there is sometimes a disconnect between those commitments that are made at the level of the international climate agreements and what countries are actually doing in terms of their national budgets. And it's very important that we, and I take this from the perspective of African countries, that African countries do not see the work to be done around climate as something which is external. Of course, there is a need for support from financing from external resources, but the ownership for the program has to be national. I will briefly touch on the example of Ethiopia's Green Legacy program, which is primarily a tree planting program, but which has a great impact in terms of the addressing the water needs of rural communities. So in the context of Ethiopia, they found that the deforestation that was happening in rural areas was having a huge impact on water catchment areas in terms of siltation. As erosion was happening, the quality of water catchment areas were affected, and this was creating a vicious circle in terms of the impact on local populations. So the tree planting program is aimed at building climate resilience, But with the support of the Economic Commission for Africa and other partners, the aim is to plant in a very targeted way so that you can reduce the impact on water catchment areas and therefore improve the availability of water in rural areas. And this involves also addressing the root cause, which is deforestation. And one of the interventions is the creation of livelihoods by the manufacturing of energy efficient cook stoves in the regions themselves. So it's about several levels of intervention, not only simply at the level of the water, but looking also at some of the root issues. Around innovative finance, and you've I think hit the nail on the head that for somebody in a rural setting, a debt for adaptation swap or a green bond means nothing. But for governments, these are means by which additional resources can be mobilized and channeled into the key areas. And it starts with, again, the identification of the right intervention. So in the case of investment in water, sanitation, and hygiene, if you've identified a rural investment opportunity and you link this with your budget process, this can be used for the purposes of a debt for adaptation swap, as long as you can link it towards actions that build climate resilience. And Ethiopia's example of the Green Legacy could be the type of project which could be used to leverage a debt for adaptation swap in other countries. And we're looking, for example, about interventions around the Great Green Wall in the Sahel, and which can be linked again to the availability of water resources in the rural setting. Similarly, the issuance of green and blue bonds, it's about identifying key performance indicators that would be linked to the availability of water in the rural setting, and which could be issued by the central government for the purposes of investing in these priorities. They can also be used to develop the entrepreneurship in rural areas, again associated with the availability of water. And the advantage of issuing a bond is that in terms of a bond issuance, is that you can link it with, for example, the availability of concessional finance for entrepreneurs in the rural setting, which therefore creates a flow of financing. And the final point that I will mention is about the opportunity for carbon offsets for water resilience, because a lot of the issues that are emerging around the availability of water in the rural setting is the degradation of the environment linked to activities around survival. So whether it be the type of agriculture that's being done or wood for firewood and so on. By mobilizing financing through carbon offsets, we can protect some of these areas which are critical for the protection of local water resources and mobilize resources in the process which can be further invested in infrastructure at the level of the community. So these are a few points that I wanted to underline as opportunities leading towards the World Water Forum, and which we must demystify for African countries to be able to look at the full array of resource mobilization tools that they can use. Thank you very much, and back to you, Catarina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adam. So it's interesting. So what I hear you saying is that you basically, the need for mobilizing more resources from these sophisticated instruments, so we can actually then use the scarce public finance for rural WASH, but also the need to align the national frameworks, and that these national frameworks are also translated into the budgets and the budget process. Which leads us to our next speaker. We have the honor to have Honorable Judith Aliek. Mrs. Alyek is a member of Parliament of Uganda since 2016. And she's also the chairperson of the Equal Opportunities Committee in the Parliament of Uganda. She has served as member of the board of the Uganda AIDS Commission and chairperson also of the HIV/AIDS Committee. She has a Master of Science in Public Health, and she has over 20 years of experience in health promotion and the education sector, particularly as maternal and child health technical advisor. Mrs. Alyek, when rural WASH services are being funded primarily by external donors, what can be the role of members of parliament to ensure the necessary budget allocations for the sector that, as you know, it's so much linked also with health, with maternal and child health, which is also your area. I hope we had some issues with sound. Let's hope to We can hear you. The floor is yours. So I see that your microphone is unmuted, which is great.
Yes, but my video,
It's okay. It's okay. We can hear you. We're happy. We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Can you see my face? You cannot.
No, we can't see your face. Well, we can see our lovely picture in the screen, but not. We can't see you live.
Oh, I think I have a problem with my camera. Thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm a member of Parliament, as you have stated. You know, Parliament of Uganda does legislation, budgeting, and appropriation, and we also do representation of the electorate. We do oversight or monitoring of the government programs. Actually, rural wash has not been prioritized during national budgeting. When you look at what we always budget for and the indicative planning figures, you find that it's so limited that rural wash has not benefited a lot from the national budget. Now, this is a very big challenge in our budgeting processes, as the government always dictates on how much should be given to wash. Now, when you look at other challenges like the issue of wash facilities in schools, hospitals, and even in the communities, there's a very big challenge. Even the technology that is being used in promoting wash in our communities is still a very big challenge. Now, we still have open defecation in the communities, which is still very high, and that is attributed to poor attitudes and the cultural practices against the implementation of rural wash interventions. Now, rural wash actually has been majorly funded by the donors. Next slide. Now, another thing that we have to look at is that we need to do assessment of water sources and the sanitation facilities. Coverage in our community mentioned had not been a priority, but this is what we are advocating for at Parliament of Uganda. Now, one key thing is political commitment. Governments should walk their talks. They have made several declarations, including Kampala Declaration of Sanitation. As an example, like in Uganda here, we have ever heard of Abuja Declaration, Alma-Ata Declaration, but do the governments walk their talks? We have laws that have been made and policies. Those are good laws on public health and rural water and sanitation, but the implementation is still very poor. Now, I think that the governments in Africa should not rely on donor funding so much as we are still advocating for donor funding. And then we also have to advocate for community participation so that if it is affordable, they can make it. If they can access the materials they can use, they can make it. If they accept the practice, then they can still make it. So the technology and everything that is available for the promotion of rural wash should be promoted. Another thing that we may look at is that the poverty level within our communities is still very appalling, because we should first of all set our priorities. Excuse me.
Judith, are you there? Hello? Judith, can you hear us? Well, this was the last slide. I'm happy that we managed to hear a little bit of the experiences of a member of parliament. And it's interesting to hear more and more that there is actually political commitment. So we've been hearing a lot about, oh, Judith, you're back?
Yes, my network is so poor, I'm sorry for that.
It's okay, you have the last slide. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm saying in the conclusion, therefore, all governments have to account for all resources used in promoting rural wash, and above all, corruption has to be tackled. You know, sometimes all the resources are swindled by the people who implement rural wash programs, and this is very appalling. It cannot promote wash practices in our communities. Then government should also have uniform standard indicators for access to wash facilities. For example, in Uganda here, you find one water source in a 2-kilometer radius. Maybe in another country, it can be in 1-kilometer radius. So you find that there's a lot of disparity in the standard indicators that we have for access to wash facilities.
We had our 2 minutes of network. Judith, thank you very much. Probably you can hear me. I will now continue. And so as I was saying, so I heard from the start of your intervention that there is political commitment. There's a lot of commitments being signed and mentioned in conferences, but then the budgets don't follow. The budgets do not go to rural areas, or even when they go, there's a lot of inequalities in the allocation, which raises a lot of issues on accountability, which is a great bridge to our next speaker, Mrs. Chilufya Chileshe. She is the Global Policy Director of WaterAid, and she has over 16 years of experience in national, regional, and global roles. She has led advocacy on water, sanitation, and hygiene in Southern Africa. And in previous roles, she has led pro-poor policy influencing and social policy research, civil society strengthening, grant making, and monitoring and evaluation initiatives. Mrs. Chileshe, WaterAid has been a strong voice in advocacy for WASH financing and resource mobilization. And so in this context of the commitments are there, but the funds are not flowing, you know, what is working, what is not working, where can we go from here? Floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks for that introduction. So just move to the next slide, please. So yeah, I think you're right to say that this is an area of work that WaterAid is really interested in. Next slide, please. Because we are working in more than 23 countries with local and national government, trying to understand precisely the question you ask, why the money is not flowing and what do we need to do to ensure that it does. And I think it's a combination of everything we have in the heading for the title of this webinar, right? So we want to mobilize those resources. We want to ensure that accountability is strong and inspires the right level of confidence to ensure that that money comes through as it should. But also this whole idea that the money gets used, because we hear very often that money for WASH projects goes back to Treasury, and yet we have very many communities in rural areas that haven't been reached, that haven't seen a drop of clean, safe water for as long as they have lived in those locations. So, and we know that up to more than 80% of countries report insufficient financing to meet those national targets. And this is in contrast to what the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action has emphasized. So there's still a lot of work to be done. One of the places that we like to start is looking at who is tracking WASH budgets. What do we know about how expenditure is happening and so and what's going in? So GLASS and the WASH accounts effort that WHO leads is one of those places that we really believe we need to be paying attention. Another is an effort that we have been doing for a few years now, trying to look at what's happening with fiscal decentralization of WASH. A few years ago, a WaterAid study that was called Think Local, Act Local found that local government funding was very low volumes, and particularly in rural local authorities. Also that local government was often being bypassed in development finance allocations. And the reluctance that we often see with devolution and decentralization overall is much more prevalent in the WASH sector. So there are quite a few issues there, and poor transparency, and delays in disbursements. So the point I was making about money going back to Treasury is a very common occurrence in many countries across Africa. So the next slide, just to answer the question more specifically that you've asked. So we've been looking at some of the ways that we think are worth championing to address the challenge of resourcing rural WASH, as well as improving that necessary accountability and enhancing the use of resources. So one of those first things we think is looking at how you reform the full range of funding sources. So others have referred to the 3 T's here. So how are national taxes being mobilized? What do we know about tariffs and how they are structured in enabling financial flows to the WASH sector? Also the big problem of public sector entities that do not pay their tariffs, but expect citizens to do so. And then, of course, what's happening with ODA. We know that for services like sanitation, the ODA hasn't been increasing for a while. And so there's need to really look across all of those funding sources and consider the reforms that are necessary and drive towards them. The other is this whole idea that we should be paying attention towards to developing district investment plans. So there are quite some good examples in countries like Zambia and Malawi, where they have paid attention to actually understanding what does it need to invest in a district-wide response. What does an investment plan look like? Where are the areas of need? How do we channel? How do we coordinate the money that comes in and ensure that we minimize the delays and the leakages? I think this idea of supporting district investment plans should be at the top of our thinking, because it really provides a framework through which we respond and understand the extent of the problem. The other is a global thing around climate finance. And with COP we're just off the heel of COP26 now, and we know that the money going into climate adaptation is very limited in comparison to other aspects, or mitigation in particular. And as part of that adaptation finance, the money going into WASH is even less. We're talking about something less than 1% is what studies find. And so one of the areas we need to be paying attention to is how that climate finance can be mobilized. And this is a mobilization issue, right? How do we ensure that we're thinking about the place of rural areas in that whole discussion around community resilience? As someone was saying earlier, increasingly we are seeing that there's a focus on growth centers, urbanizing centers as places to direct this climate finance. But I think it's important to remember that even though the effects are much more visible in urban settings, the rural communities are just as affected, and the resilience factor is much more heightened there, the need for resilience. So we have to be thinking about climate finance. The fourth, and I have 5 recommendations because the chair asked for 5. So my fourth one is, I guess, fiscal decentralization, which I've referred to. So we're not saying there should be more and more fiscal decentralization, even in countries where it isn't currently happening, but we want whatever level exists, of decentralization exists, is accompanied by a decentralization of fiscal planning and actual transfers to those local levels, so that the money is as close to the points of delivery as possible. And we think that that's a way of addressing those bottlenecks, but improving the capacity of local government to track when progress is slow and to mitigate, but also that very essential progress chasing. And I guess the 5th one seems to summarize everything I'm saying, because it's about strengthening the enabling environment overall. And this includes, regulation, increasing the accountability mechanisms, as well as participation, So we haven't spoken about participation as much here, but I think it's a really critical part of ensuring that we understand whether the services are adequate or reaching the people as they should, particularly of women, children, and others that are affected. So I'll leave it here and sort of emphasize that most of these are about setting the context or the framework to ensure that we can attract the money, we can use it, and that we can be accountable for it for the benefit of rural WASH progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Chileshe. I think two of the new points that you brought into this discussion are the issues of, so even the limited funds for rural WASH that are not spent and go back to Treasury. So you brought in the issues of public financial management and fiscal decentralization. These are issues of governance, but I think one of the points here is that how far can we in the water sector influence some of these broader issues of public financial management in some of the countries? So that's quite a challenge. But then you brought in, for instance, a very interesting and very practical solution, which is really, instead of going from project to project or hand pump to hand pump or small pipe schemes, really go for district investment plans, having more long-term plans of how the districts are going to achieve SDG 6 and leave no one behind. And that also includes civic participation. So thank you for bringing those additional points. We did not know if we had our final speaker, Neil Cole. He cannot be here with us, but he is on video. So start preparing for, I have already a lot of questions. I've been trying to also keep an eye on the questions, but do put more questions, please. And I'll introduce Neil. So Neil Cole is the Executive Secretary of the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, it's CABRI, which is an intergovernmental organization that provides a platform for peer learning and exchange for approximately 30 African ministries of finance and planning. And it's very nice because he brought in the discussions of water into that platform. Mr. Cole has more than 20 years professional experience in the field of public financial management, and between 2001 and 2013, he also worked for the National Treasury of South Africa. So Mr. Cole's presentation is going to focus a little bit, we haven't heard yet of the quantification on the numbers. So he focuses on the quantification of the financial and economic gaps in the sector. And then he also provides some entry points to improve efficiency with existing funding. Team, please, we can start playing the video.
Good morning, distinguished participants. It is my honor to join you in this introductory webinar hosted by Africa's Premium Development Bank. I'm sure that the preference of all participants would have been to engage in person. But like all challenges we have faced as Africans, this too shall pass, and we will one day meet again in person. More than 320 million people lack access to safe drinking water in sub-Saharan Africa. And more than 1 in 3 Africans are facing water scarcity. Extreme climate events are likely going to exacerbate the phenomenon because African countries remain extremely vulnerable to climate risks such as flooding and droughts. Flooding contaminates drinking water and destroys hygiene and wastewater systems, while droughts cause the most deaths by creating food insecurity that leads to malnutrition and denies communities of water supplies. With regards to sanitation, 1 in 4 people in Africa still lack access to adequate sanitation infrastructure, and only 28% benefit from at least basic sanitation services. The benefits of investing in water and sanitation services are immense. The projected economic returns of universal access to basic sanitation are $4.3 for every $1 invested in North Africa and $2.8 for sub-Saharan Africa. Investments in basic drinking water services can also yield significant economic benefits, estimated at $2.5 per dollar invested in North Africa and $2.4 per dollar invested in sub-Saharan Africa. The main benefits of WASH investment in Africa are derived from the value of time savings and health-related improvements, especially the value of saved lives. Our sustainable development goal aspirations are going to come at a high cost. Sub-Saharan Africa alone is estimated to require 35.5 billion every year in capital costs to reach universal access to safely managed water and sanitation services. Sustaining these interventions will require an equally important investment in operational and maintenance costs, which are often, unfortunately, neglected. Therefore, value for money considerations are particularly important in the WASH sector, especially the measurements of how much is being paid for goods and services, getting more for the same amount of inputs, completing projects on time and according to the specifications, and also achieving equity in a way that has been ethical. When looking closely at expenditure on WASH, however, total investments are far from sufficient to meet universal access to basic services. The challenge is even more daunting now as African governments entered the COVID economic crisis in a context of limited fiscal space. Many countries had little option but to cut on capital expenditure investments to accommodate a more constrained public purse. And we have yet to see CapEx numbers bouncing back to 2019 levels. The scale of water and sanitation needs in Africa requires a shift in the way finance for the sector is planned. WASH services require a substantial increase in investment sources, including households, national and local governments, and external finance from donors, as well as investments by the private sector. A few considerations for the future. A good starting point is to better understand the financial flows in the sector, both public and private. And it essentially revolves around the question, who is paying for what? This would allow us to set tariffs, taxes, and transfers in a more efficient and equitable way. Reviewing tariffs may be overdue in many countries, but these need to be accompanied by improved governance and service levels. For example, a study in the Tunisian capital, where networked water and sanitation services received significant government subsidies, it was found that high-income households receive 1.4 times the subsidy the poor receive for water supply, and twice as much as the poor for sanitation, because they utilize significantly more water and wastewater services. Allocative decisions to WASH need to consider value for money, therefore, and absorptive capacity issues. It is necessary to prioritize spending in the sector, which will involve increased spending in rural areas, alongside an increased investment in WASH. Mechanisms to increase domestic funds can also be considered, such as earmarked taxes and surcharges, enforcement of fines, and incentives for local governments to invest in the sector. As our public finances slowly recover and investment in CapEx starts to return to pre-2019 levels, the WASH sector will be required to improve capabilities in policy design, planning and budgeting with innovative financing present, and in particular, scale up our implementation capacity. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Neil, from a distance. Thank you for that video. And thank you very much for everyone to sticking to their time. Fantastic. Very, very proud of all of us. So now I'm going to ask, can we take down the presentation and just put the video of everyone? I am going, then we can see all our panelists. Can we have your videos if possible? I know that Judith is having some issues. I have been flooded with questions, and I have now 3 sets of 2 questions, and I have some allocations. But if you want to speak, please raise your hand, because now I can see you. We are missing, so we have Ijeoma. Judith, can you hear us at least? Can you try to unmute yourself?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, you're there. Great, great, fantastic. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of the warm up with 2 questions. So one question is question from Grégoire Diouf. So what are the challenges facing domestic resource mobilization in African countries for financing rural water infrastructures? I know it's a big question, it's very broad, but what are the key, basically what are the key problems in why can't we raise more domestic resources? And if we can have 1 or 2 bullet points. And linked with that, there is a question from Gauthier Sakasaka. I will translate from French. So isn't the problem, is the initial problem actually linked with the inadequate evaluation of the needs in the sector? Are we having a proper understanding of what are the needs in the first place? I don't know who would like to give it a shot. Maybe, I mean, in terms of what are the main constraints, maybe Ijeoma, would you like to kickstart?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's a laundry list of them. I think for us, something we see a lot of is really, you know, for rural wash, this, I won't say it's a notion, but I'll say it's this idea, and when we're doing our project, that is this whole public good versus private good, and why should, because we try to really leverage private financing, and we spend a lot of time really talking to private sector, and the question always is why, and I know somebody asked a question around sort of bankability. So compared to sort of our urban water supply project, et cetera, where we're able to show, and where it's readily clear to sort of private sector, it's much more difficult to make the case, honestly, around sort of why sort of private sector should be involved, really when it comes to financing. So that is our greatest hurdle in this sector. Is really sort of, and also really sort of when we're talking sort of at the national level, trying to sort of make that case to national governments that the money will be better sort of utilized sort of at the local level, right? Might be another sort of issue that we see a lot of. So a lot of money gets sort of returned because there are not enough local level actors, including even sort of the NGOs, when it comes to decision making. So yeah, but I could go on and on, but I think these are sort of the 2 sort of top things that we see. I hope that helps.
Just because it's connected with another question, when you talk about private sector, what entities of what type of private sector do you, service providers,
we're talking about
or?
Really around sort of, usually in this sector, we're talking about microfinanciers. So people that have a sort of, so bringing microfinanciers into the sector is really the primary sort of private sector entities we're looking at. Yeah, so really financing, you know, but really at the micro level, and sort of making that case that there is sort of money to be made, for lack of a better term, for them in this sector. It's quite tricky. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to add? What are the main constraints to bring in finance to rural wash?
If I may, Catarina?
Go ahead.
Yeah. We've said it many times that we should not discount the policy issue as well, and the prioritization at the local level. We saw the development of a number of policies within, for example, county or decentralized systems of governance that really didn't take into consideration the issue of rural wash. There's also in terms of the political will, it rests heavily on that as well. The issue of the demand, and this demand being undermined again by the issue of participation from these communities. Did you know that a lot of decentralized or district type of governments do not budget for public participation? This is something that rests heavily on the NGO, in the NGO sector, whereby we have been pushing a lot of these governments to put up some funding towards this public participation and get the voice and the support that would go towards, you know, unblocking funding for rural WASH. Maybe to touch a bit on the issue of private sector enterprises and the size of some of these enterprises. I think we should also be looking at the social enterprises, which operate a lot within these rural areas. Now, we've come across quite a few of them who are doing water bottling, setting up connections, providing raw water, having livelihood activities around water, whether it's beekeeping, tree planting. But what they need is their capacity to be built so that they can be investment ready. But they're there and they're already doing this kind of work. What they need is a better understanding of complying with the overarching system and the regulation and the policy. But what they also need is that there is a possibility for them, and we're seeing it in one particular program we're involved in, where they are attracting, even if it's small ticket sizes, but they are attracting interest. And this can build to something a lot bigger. And we have seen that they are trying to bridge a certain gap, even selling drinking water at a much cheaper price. Thank you, Catarina.
Thank you, Serene. I think you bridged well into another question. So there's a question from Tim Brewer on how do we finance accountability? What do effective accountability structure costs? How do we ensure this participation and accountability? And this relates also with a question from Gautier Sakasaka on when there's lack of trust between citizens and their governments, how can we set up some of these mechanisms as well? So we are all working in very different settings. Some are with more functional government structures, others more emergent. How do we bring in accountability into some of these contexts? Before I give the word to Judith, to Chilufya, I see that Jean-Paul, you have your hand in the air. It was for the previous.
It was for the previous, but I can cover this one. I can cover this one as well. So I think, Sareen mentioned this a bit, that one of the key elements is linking investments in WASH with livelihoods. This is something which is important, first of all, to sometimes convince governments, because they're asked, I mean, it may sound surprising, but sometimes the reason that governments are not putting resources in this area, and we have to recognize that fiscal space in Africa is very limited. And you are essentially trying to decide about funding. It's a budget that can never be met. There are always gaps in the budget. And governments often make the choice of fully funding something. Sometimes it's the wrong choice because often defense gets put at the top. It's a personal opinion, but rather than the social sectors. And I think we need to show that investment in WASH, for example, is actually critical for growth, and data does show that. And so that link with livelihoods, I think, is one of the key ways in which you can help convince governments, but you create also the base for bankable projects and investments also by the private sector, because and the investment, I will always say clearly, the governments must lead. So it does depend having that very strong framework within national budgets and within local government budgets, and a very clear plan on what they want to do, but linking it as well with the ultimate creation of livelihoods. For example, in agriculture, you'll have very little value addition if you do not have dependable access to water. So not to belabor the point, I think that would, the thing we've been trying to do at ECA through our analysis is always linking the investments with the creation of employment and jobs. On the accountability side, I think what we've been trying to do is work on key performance indicators. And again, the choice of the indicators is key. Too often indicators are chosen from the perspective of budgets rather than from the perspective of stakeholders and participants. And I think it's about selecting key performance indicators that really show the progress that is made in a particular community, whether it's the access to water specifically or to the appropriate resources. But again, you can have indicators that also have an economic perspective, including around livelihoods. Thanks.
Thank you. On key performance indicators, Uganda is known for its golden indicators in the sector as well. So I would like to give the word to Honorable Alyek on this issue of bringing in or financing accountability or ensuring there are formal accountability mechanisms in the sector, because as we see, they are extremely, they are very much related with also with resource mobilization. Judith, the floor is yours. I see you unmuted. We cannot hear you. Let's wait a few seconds. In the meantime.
Can you hear me?
Now, yes, we have your 2 minutes. Go.
I'm sorry for the interruptions in the network. It has not been easy for me. But I would like to comment on the issue of accountability. We are aware that a lot of money has been invested in rural wash, but the coverage for the wash facilities is still very low across Africa. This is one thing that we should not cover our eyes on. We are seeing what's happening in government. We are seeing that the government has not yet prioritized the issues of rural wash. We are aware of that. But then one key thing that we should really see is that the organizations that put in their money must have stringent measures on the planning, the implementation, and the monitoring of the rural wash programs in Africa. Less than that, I want to assure the people who are in this panel that we are not moving anywhere. Year after year, when you move to the rural communities, you find there's still a gross lack of water. We have people with poor facilities, poor sanitation facilities. We still have high burden of sanitation-related illnesses. And all these are being reported in our health facilities. More than 75% of the diseases reported in the health centers are sanitation-related. Even when COVID came, we thought COVID would come and we could have dealt away with it. But see how COVID has escalated because we have not prioritized wash in the communities. So people even lack water for washing hands. People lack water for cooking. People lack water for bathing. As I talk now, in the community where I come from, 128 villages don't have water facilities. They are not there. There are no boreholes. There are no wells. People are getting water from swamps, but we have really advocated for this. We have every year, year in, year out, we are advocating for good water facilities to be given to our people. Now, where are we heading to? Can we set targets? Can we set targets? Can we make government sit down and set targets? And really, we have ever heard about governments coming together in big meetings, big conferences, they are making declarations, they are signing them, but you find that when they go back to their respective countries, nothing is done. So how long shall we keep on advocating for the improvement of WASH in the communities? It is a high time governments change their strategies. They should walk their talks. They should walk their talks, because when we see our mothers who are going far distances to fetch water, it's appalling. A pregnant woman moving like 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers or so, carrying water on the head, going back. She has left children at home. There's no food for them. So how do you really expect the livelihood of our communities to improve without improvement of water facilities? Secondly, when the children are going to school, like in Uganda here, the children have not yet gone back to school because of COVID. We have been in a lockdown for almost 2 years. But when you see the situation in the rural villages, I mean in the villages, it is very appalling. In addition to the lack of water that they have, our children are dying because of sanitation-related illnesses. And it also takes, even if they go to school, it takes them a lot of time to get water for even drinking at school. You find even in schools, there's no water. And the girls are suffering, you know, the issues of menstruation. They are not able to access water. There are no facilities put for them to even, so they end up dropping out of school. So where is the world going if the children are dropping out of school, especially the girls? The children are dying of sanitation-related illnesses, and the death rate or the mortality rate is very high, and we are seeing this, and we are policymakers. We have closed our eyes as if nothing is happening. So I keep repeating that
that was our 2-minute window for the connection of Judith. Judith, I mean, it's a pleasure to hear you. I myself, and I'm sure all the other listeners, we would wish to hear other inspiring members of parliament that talk with the same passion as you. And as yourself, I've met quite a couple of girls that dropped out of school because they had no menstrual hygiene facilities, or they had to carry the water for their parents. And indeed, I mean, and we all know this. So we know the impact of lack of rural WASH in health, in hygiene, in the education, which then has an impact of livelihoods. We're talking about it, that ultimately has an impact on growth. It's okay. And that ultimately has an impact on growth, as mentioned by Jean Paul. So for how long are we going to keep, you know that, we know this. So how long are we going to keep advocating, and what do we need? So is it our ministries of finance that don't know the realities of their countries? Is it us in the water sector that do not speak their language and therefore cannot influence it? So where is it? Well, we all know, we seem to know the issues. We've been talking about it. I've been talking about it for the past 23 years that I'm in the water sector. So how do we move forward? We need to be inspiring as well, and to have some very specific measures to change how things are going. Anyone? I saw Nelson with a hand in the air. Oops, sorry, or Chilufya also.
So
Nelson,
somebody else is taking over?
Yes, Judith, someone else is taking over.
I raised my hand, but it's because I wanted to like link to what we have heard from the Honorable MP, that there is a comment I've seen, which is also like a patterned comment from Cameroon. This is Stephen Tongti. He says, when I theoretically hear of rural WASH program, I consider it fiction. In the part of the world where I come from, it's dry season in Cameroon, and to fetch water for the family in most rural communities has become very difficult. In my community, this is Stephen continuing, in the northwestern community, there is nothing like hygiene, and it becomes more or less like a normal phenomenon in managing personal hygiene without water. Imagine women going through menstruation with that kind of a situation. And then he continues to say, I grew up using leaves as the toilet paper, and 50 years after that, the situation is the same back in his village. That's a reflection from Stephen. So it's really like what the honorable member is raising, that we still have the same situation playing out, and the question is probably what should we really change? And of course, Stephen finishes the contribution by highlighting the issues of monitoring, and probably also the development partners, probably they are treating this issue with arm's length. We don't monitor much, and I think honorable member also mentioned about the issues of corruption. These are things that I think Stephen mentioned in this as well. But I wanted to read also a question from Sylvan, who was asking, how can we involve the private sector in financing WASH projects in rural areas? Probably it's a question of how can we have new players as well, and to change the way we approach the issues of rural WASH, over and above, of course, making sure that the government agencies are doing their work. Thank you so much, Catarina.
I think I saw Chilufya, you had your hand in the air. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I think that there's a lot in there that's been said. And others are asking, how do we not have this discussion next year and the year after that and so on? Do we know the needs? How do we resolve this? I think that that's a good place to sort of have this reflection. One of the things that we believe at WaterAid is that there is need for a whole of government leadership on this issue. I think very frequently the problem of WASH is parceled out to a WASH ministry or a WASH department that is not, let's be realistic. I mean, in most countries it's not considered the primary or the prime ministries. It's one of those ministries that is sort of, well, it's useful to have, and they name a minister and so on. Maybe they get funded, maybe they don't. Maybe they have the capacity they need, maybe they don't. So I think there's something about ensuring that we're putting the case here really, really clearly. So I think for the longest time, we've sort of focused on the value of WASH as a public health imperative, the value of WASH in improving people's quality of life. And increasingly, particularly during the COVID pandemic, we're realizing that there's an economic case to be made for investing in water, sanitation, and hygiene. And that for me requires a whole of government leadership, which is what I started with. So how do we ensure that there is a clear representation of what investing in WASH means on a national development scale? What is the place of rural areas in that whole agenda? And how do we respond accordingly? I think that there is also a need to ensure that we are ring fencing the money that goes for WASH, because as the point I was making earlier, if people think that it's the sector that you can ignore every so often, they then divert budget lines to other things. So I think we need to be increasingly advocating for national level ring fencing of WASH financing, so that when it's allocated, it's spent on WASH and is actually dispersed. We don't often see this. The other is, I guess, a really strong dedication to progress chasing and targets. And I think Judith was speaking about targets. So having targets that governments can be held accountable for at the district level, at the national level, and building in those accountability mechanisms that help us do this. And it's always easier said than done, but there are countries that have managed to start the steps towards this. So I think that learning and ensuring that we spotlight those good examples is another way of ensuring that we can really stick to this commitment.
Thank you, Chilufya. And I do hope that during the e-discussions, we have some of those, during the different weeks, we do have some of those good examples being brought forward by different African colleagues. So I would like now to do the last two questions before we go to the closing remarks, which are, so it's two questions from Grégoire Diouf, which are, what are the impacts of climate change in mobilizing rural WASH infrastructure, how to deal with it when we bring in the whole need for much more long-term resilient infrastructure? And what are the main innovative mechanisms financing identified so far in the Africa region in resource mobilization for rural WASH? Who would like to? I think you all mentioned maybe we go back.
I'm happy.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take this one on climate change.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of my 5 takeaways for today was, we need to be thinking about climate finance in relation to rural communities, because for me, a concern is that increasingly we are realizing that there needs to be more climate adaptation finance going to WASH. But the majority of the examples you see now are flooding city and so on and so forth. And we know there are big challenges with urban WASH. But once we start to make those the poster child of what the effects of climate are, then it's very easy to overshadow the fact that actually rural communities are suffering effects just as dying. And I think that for me is the balance that's required, but also the greater focus on realizing that for rural communities, this is a struggle they have lived with for very long already. And we have to recognize what climate change then does, exacerbating the situation, and therefore the response must be even swifter. So hopefully the impact is positive, is what I'm saying. We have to be working towards making the impact of climate by mobilizing that climate finance because of this.
And we started having those discussions, and COP26 is the first time that the water sector was so much highlighted within the climate discussions, is already also a step in that direction. Maybe we end with African Development Bank. What has been working really well in terms of innovative financing for rural WASH? You had mentioned microfinance, for instance. Is any?
So this is where I don't know. Nelson is my colleague is here who has more extensive experience in the bank. What I will say, though, sorry, let me turn on my camera.
Thank you.
Yes, can you see me now?
Yes.
What I will say though is that we are doing quite an overhaul in terms of our approach to rural WASH. So I'm sure you're all aware of this rural water supply and sanitation initiative. We're absolutely restructuring it and merging it into the Africa Water Facility. The Africa Water Facility has a sort of a bigger base in terms of donors, but more importantly has done a lot in terms of larger projects. But my colleague, Nelson, who has really worked in the sector for years at the bank, can maybe give some feedback, because I want him to jump in. This is beyond his role as a moderator. So Nelson, I'll pass it on to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ijeoma. So I can definitely share that within the bank portfolio or operations as well, as you know, we respond mostly to the needs of the government, and mostly this would be through loans. But then, as Ijeoma mentioned, we have the Rural Water Supply and Sanitation Initiative, which has also a trust fund component and has been helping quite a lot in terms of providing grants. And over the 2 decades of the existence of the Rural Water Supply and Sanitation Initiative, we've seen more and more also of the bank investing some of the loan operations within the rural context as well. I can just give an example. For example, in Namibia, we have a recent program approved there where the government has a focus on the rural WASH needs as well, alongside, of course, within the municipalities of Windhoek. But these are the programs that we would like to see, making sure that there is also a linkage with the other aspects of livelihood. For example, making sure that we are providing WASH services in rural context, but at the same time, increasing and expanding the purpose of that particular operation to make sure that it addresses the needs of nutrition, for example, creation of employment. These are things that the bank has been doing, of course, through the grants that accompany the loan operations as well. And we're doing a similar type of work in Sierra Leone and also in other countries, for example, in Malawi, Zambia, as well as Egypt within the North Africa region as well. That's what I can share in addition to what Ijeoma mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. And thank you to all the speakers. We're moving to the closing remarks. So this session has really, basically, we're just opening the big box for the discussions over the next 3 weeks. And I see there's a lot of very, very relevant comments and questions also through the chat. We will try to capture that also in the documents that will follow. I think one of the issues that maybe we didn't discuss yet so much here is actually to make the most out of what we already have. So the more efficient use of existing resources. So the reforms on tariffs, reforms on subsidies, because there's quite a lot of funds that can be mobilized from already existing sources. I would like to give the closing remarks to Juste Nansi. Juste is the IRC country director of Burkina Faso. He has more than 20 years of experience, especially in the whole area of water resources, water resource management in the Sahel and Francophone countries. Just 3 minutes, please. You are muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. I was thanking you very much, Catarina, for your facilitation, and thanking also very much all the panelists for their great contribution. I've been listening and learning a lot from all of them. I think one of the very great things that I've got from this session is the very high level and creative contributions from the people from the finance world that we don't use to meet in, or we don't have the opportunity to talk with in our session, in our discussions. So this is a very great input and contribution. So thanks so much for this. I would like very much to emphasize on the need of all of you, the call to all of the participants to join the e-discussions for continuing these discussions, and I would say even more importantly, to continue sharing the solutions for addressing the resource mobilization challenges that we've thoroughly discussed about in this session. And also share the messages to the decision makers, to the high level authorities, for the people from the finance sector, to the donors about these challenges and what they would expect them to do or to change. I think that would be really critical. I would like to thank again all the panelists from all the for their contribution, the translator, the facilitators, the participants, for all the questions. We may not have responded all the questions that have been asked here, but we really hope that we can take these discussions forward in the e-discussions. So once again, I'm insisting on your participation and your contribution, and please share the links with all in your networks and make sure that people from the other sectors that are really relevant to this discussion, I mean mainly the people from the finance sector, public finance sector, please share this link with them and ask them to join this discussion, because I believe that this is also part of the things that we can do differently to change the process and to get new ideas and new solutions to this challenge. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Juste. Thank you, everyone, all the panelists, all the attendees for this interesting discussion. We moved some of the discussion forward. We're talking much more cross-sectoral. We're talking larger finance. We're talking livelihoods. So this is going in the right direction, and I look forward to the results of the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Catarina.